The advertisement on the community board at St. Mary's Hospital was simple. A single white index card with bold black lettering. Private caregiver wanted. Competitive salary. Room and board provided. Serious inquiries only. Below the text, a phone number and one instruction: call after 7 p.m. Nora Keller, a 34-year-old nurse with tired eyes, stared at it for a long minute. She had just been laid off due to budget cuts. Her savings were evaporating. The rent was due in a week. The words competitive salary felt like a lifeline. That evening, she dialed the number. The man who answered had a deep, smooth voice that felt practiced, like a radio host or a salesman. He introduced himself as Victor Price. He asked very few questions about her qualifications, which she found odd. Instead, he focused on her personality. Was she discreet? Was she comfortable with solitude? Could she follow instructions without question? Nora, desperate, answered yes to everything. Victor explained the job. His father, Edward Price, was an elderly man suffering from a degenerative condition that made him weak and confused. He needed round-the-clock monitoring and care. The family home was located in the Blackwood Mountains, a remote area several hours from the city. It was isolated, Victor warned, but the pay would reflect the inconvenience. He offered her a sum that made her gasp. It was triple what she made at the hospital. He told her to pack for a long stay and that a car would pick her up at the Greyhound station in the town of Millbrook on Friday. Before hanging up, Victor added one final instruction, his voice losing its friendly tone for just a second. My father might say things. Confusing things. He might even claim things that sound alarming. You must understand, his mind is failing. The most important part of your job, Nora, is to not believe him. The drive to the Price residence took over an hour from the small town of Millbrook. The car was a black SUV with tinted windows, driven by a silent man in a cap who did not introduce himself and refused Nora's attempts at small talk. The paved road quickly turned to gravel, and then to a narrow dirt path that wound through dense pine forests. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out the late afternoon sun and plunging the world into a premature twilight. Just as Nora began to feel a prickle of unease, the trees parted, and the house appeared. It was a vast, looming structure built from gray stone and dark wood, 3 stories tall, with a steeply pitched roof and numerous chimneys. It looked like something from an old photograph, a relic from a century past. Ivy crawled up one side, covering several windows. The SUV stopped in front of a heavy oak door. The driver retrieved her single suitcase from the trunk, placed it on the gravel, and got back in the car without a word. Before Nora could even ask a question, the SUV was rumbling back down the path, disappearing into the trees, leaving her completely alone with the massive, silent house. She stood there for a moment, the cool mountain air biting at her cheeks, the only sound the whisper of wind through the pines. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the money, and walked to the door. Before she could knock, it swung open. A woman stood there, probably in her early 60s, with a pinched, severe face and gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a simple black dress and a white apron. You must be the nurse, the woman said, her voice flat. I'm Mrs. Hive, the housekeeper. Mr. Price is waiting for you in the library. Follow me. She turned without waiting for a response, her sensible shoes squeaking on the polished stone floor. Nora stepped inside, her senses immediately assaulted by the smell of old wood, dust, and something floral and cloying that she couldn't quite identify. The interior of the house was as grand and cold as the exterior. The entrance hall featured a sweeping staircase and a massive chandelier that was dark and covered in dust. Mrs. Hyde led her through dimly lit corridors, past closed doors and portraits of stern-faced men and women whose eyes seemed to follow them. Finally, they stopped before a set of tall wooden doors. Mrs. Hyde knocked once, then opened one of the doors without waiting for an answer. "The nurse is here," she announced, and stepped aside for Nora to enter. The library was a cozy contrast to the rest of the house. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with thousands of books. Two large leather armchairs faced the fire, and in one of them sat a man. He was not Victor. This man was older, probably in his late 70s, with a gaunt face and thin white hair. He was wrapped in a plaid blanket. Standing by the fireplace, holding a glass of amber liquid, was Victor Price. He was exactly as she imagined from his voice, handsome, well-dressed, with a charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nora, welcome," he said warmly. He gestured to the older man. "This is my father, Edward." Edward looked at Nora. His eyes were not the eyes of a confused, failing mind. They were sharp, clear, and filled with something that looked a lot like fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but Victor cut him off smoothly. "Father, this is Nora. She's going to be staying with us to help you." Victor's smile remained fixed, but Nora noticed the tension in his jaw. Edward closed his mouth, the fear in his eyes deepening. He just nodded slowly. Victor spent the next 30 minutes walking Nora through the house, explaining her duties. The rules were strict. Her primary area was the second floor. She was not to go down to the basement for any reason. The door was locked for safety. She was not to disturb Victor in his office on the third floor. Meals would be left in the kitchen. Visitors were not permitted. As he led her back to the main hall, Victor paused. "My father's mind wanders. He may speak of things that seem real. Your job is to provide care, not to engage with his fantasies. Do you understand?" Nora nodded, but a cold knot was forming in her stomach. Her first night was unsettling. Edward's room was down the hall from hers. She checked on him before going to bed, finding him sitting up in the dark, staring out the window at the black wall of trees. He didn't acknowledge her presence. She introduced herself softly, reminding him she was there if he needed anything. He just whispered, "It's too late." She returned to her own room, a sparse but comfortable space with a single window overlooking the back of the property. There was no phone, no television. Her cell phone showed no service. She was completely cut off. The silence was profound, broken only by the ancient house settling and the occasional hoot of an owl. She barely slept. The next morning, she found Mrs. Hyde in the kitchen, a cavernous room with old-fashioned appliances. The housekeeper was silent, handing her a tray with Edward's breakfast without a word. When Nora asked her how long she had worked for the family, Mrs. Hyde simply said, "Long enough to know when to keep my mouth shut," and walked away. Taking the tray to Edward's room, Nora found him more alert. He was sitting in the armchair by his own small fireplace. He thanked her for the food, his manners impeccable. As she helped him with his tea, he fixed her with that same clear, frightened gaze. "You seem kind," he said quietly. "Kinder than the last one. Where did she go, I wonder?" Nora, remembering Victor's warning, simply said she didn't know. Edward leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The door in the basement. Have you seen it? It's not locked for my safety. It's locked to keep everyone else out." To keep the truth in. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Price, your son said you might have confusing thoughts. Edward gave a sad, hollow laugh. My son is the reason I'm a prisoner in my own home. This is my house. And he has taken it. Just then, the door opened. Victor stood there, his charming smile in place, but his eyes were icy. Father, telling stories again, he said lightly. He placed a hand on Nora's shoulder. His grip was a little too firm. Nora, why don't you take a break? I'll sit with him for a while. Nora had no choice but to leave. As she walked down the hall, she heard Victor's voice, low and calm, and then silence. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Edward would speak to her in fragments whenever Victor was out of earshot. He talked about his late wife, Margaret, who had died 5 years ago under what he called mysterious circumstances. He mentioned a business partner, a man named Samuel Croft, who had disappeared around the same time. They all thought I had money, Edward whispered to her one afternoon. The house, the land, it looks valuable. But it's a trap. It eats money. I was broke. But Victor doesn't know that. He thinks there's a fortune hidden somewhere. He thinks Samuel and I hid it. He's been looking for years. He pointed a shaky finger toward the floor. He thinks it's in the basement. That's why it's locked. He doesn't want anyone else finding it before he does. Nora listened, her professional detachment warring with her growing unease. She tried to rationalize it. This was classic paranoia, a common symptom in elderly patients. But the details were so specific. The name Samuel Croft. The timeline of his wife's death. The logic held a strange coherence. She tried to search on her phone whenever she had a signal. Nothing. She was completely in the dark. Mrs. Hive remained a ghost, appearing only to deliver meals with terrifying silence. Victor was polite but distant, often leaving early in the morning and not returning until late at night. One evening, while Victor was away, Nora was bringing Edward his dinner. He grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. You have to help me, he pleaded desperately. I'm not crazy. The basement door. There's a mark on it. A scratch. It wasn't there before. He's bringing things down there. Or someone. I hear things at night. Nora gently freed her wrist. Mr. Price, I can't. Your son gave me strict orders. Edward's face fell. He released her and turned away. Of course. They always say that. And then they disappear. That night, Nora lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Edward's words echoed in her mind. They always say that. And then they disappear. The last caregiver. Where was she? The next day, Victor was home. He found Nora in the kitchen pouring coffee. He leaned against the counter casually. How are you finding the job? Managing okay with the isolation? She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. It's quiet, but your father is good company. Victor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Has he been talking? Saying anything that might concern you? This was the moment. She could tell him the truth, or she could protect the fragile old man who looked at her with such desperate eyes. He talks about his wife sometimes, she said carefully. It seems to comfort him. Victor studied her for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Good. Keep him comfortable. That's all we can ask." He walked away, but Nora felt his eyes on her back until she left the room. His casual inquiry felt like a test. That night, the house was restless. The wind howled around the corners. Nora was jolted awake by a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from below. From the basement. She sat up, her skin prickling. Thump. 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 It went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. Then she heard it again. This time, it was followed by a muffled scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. Her mind raced back to Edward's words. "He's bringing things down there." Or someone. Was there someone else in the house? Was that someone a prisoner? She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, she made a decision. She had to know. She had to at least look at the basement door, as Edward had asked. The basement door was located in a narrow alcove under the main staircase, hidden from view. Nora had passed it a dozen times without a second glance. Now, it loomed before her. It was a heavy, solid wood door, painted a dark, dull green. It looked old, but the lock was new, a shiny, industrial-grade deadbolt that seemed wildly out of place. She ran her fingers over the wood, searching for the scratch Edward had mentioned. At first, she didn't see it. Then, at about waist height, near the edge of the doorframe, she found it. It was a deep, fresh gash in the wood, as if someone had tried to pry the door open. The wood around it was splintered. This wasn't an old mark. This was recent. Her blood ran cold. Edward hadn't imagined it. Someone had tried to force this door open. Or perhaps someone on the other side had tried to get out. The thought was horrifying. Just then, a voice spoke directly behind her, making her jump. "Looking for something, Miss Keller?" It was Mrs. Hive. The housekeeper had materialized out of thin air, her face expressionless, but her eyes sharp. Nora's heart was pounding. "I heard a noise last night. I was checking." Mrs. Hive looked from Nora's face to the basement door and back. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. Was it sympathy? Warning? It was gone before Nora could read it. "There are many noises in an old house," Mrs. Hive said flatly. "Best to ignore them. Mr. Victor does not like anyone near this door. It would be a shame if you lost such a well-paying position." It was a threat, thinly veiled. Nora nodded, mumbled an apology, and hurried away. But the image of that fresh scratch on the locked door was burned into her brain. It was proof. Proof that Edward's fears were not fantasies. Someone was lying. And the question now was, what, or who, was behind that door? For the next 2 days, Nora played the perfect employee. She tended to Edward with extra care and kept her conversations light. But she watched Victor. She noticed the way his eyes drifted to the basement door whenever he passed it. She noticed he was home more often, as if keeping an eye on her. Edward, sensing her fear, grew quieter. He stopped telling her stories, as if he had given up hope. On the third night, Nora decided to act. She couldn't leave, there was no way to call for a ride. Her only option was to find out the truth. She waited until well past midnight, until the house was utterly still. Victor had retired to his third-floor office. Mrs. Hive's quarters were in an annex off the kitchen. Silently, Nora crept out of her room and down the main staircase. The moon was bright, casting silver shadows through the tall windows. She moved on bare feet, avoiding the creaky floorboards. She reached the alcove under the stairs. The green door loomed in front of her. The deadbolt gleamed. She had no key. But she had noticed something during her earlier inspection. The door was old, and the frame was even older. The wood was dry and slightly warped. She pulled a sturdy metal nail file from her pocket, the only tool she had. She inserted it between the door and the frame, right where the latch met the strike plate. She pushed and pried. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Every tiny creak sounded like a gunshot. Then, with a soft click that made her freeze, the latch gave way. The door was open a crack. She held her breath, listening. Nothing. Slowly, carefully, she pulled the heavy door open just wide enough to slip through. The darkness beyond was absolute. A thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed the faint moonlight. Nora pulled out her cell phone, using it as a weak flashlight. The beam revealed a set of narrow, steep wooden stairs leading down. The air that wafted up was cold, damp, and smelled of earth and rust. She took a shaky breath and started her descent. Each step creaked under her weight. The walls were rough stone, dripping with moisture. She counted 15 steps before her feet touched concrete. She was in the basement. She raised her phone, sweeping the light around. The space was vast, stretching under the entire house. It was a labyrinth of old storage rooms, coal bins, and support pillars. She saw furniture draped in white sheets, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and cobwebs thick as curtains. She moved forward slowly, her heart in her throat. Then her light fell on something that made her stop dead. In a cleared space near the back wall, there was a chair. A plain wooden chair, but it was new. Next to it, in the dust, were scuff marks. And drag marks, leading away towards a darker corner. Her hands shook. She forced herself to follow the drag marks. They led to a small room, once perhaps a wine cellar. The door was heavy but not locked. She pushed it open. The smell that hit her was the worst part. It was the smell of human waste, sweat, and terror. Her light found a mattress on the floor, a filthy blanket, and a plastic water bottle. And on the mattress, blinking in the sudden light, was a person. A man. He was thin, pale, with a matted beard and wild, terrified eyes. He raised a hand to shield his face. "Please," he croaked, his voice raw. "Please, who are you? Have you come to help me?" Nora stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Edward was right. The nightmare was real. For a moment, Nora was paralyzed. A real person, a prisoner, in the basement of this isolated house. The man on the mattress stared at her, his initial hope fading, replaced by despair. "You're one of them," he whispered. Another one of his. Nora shook her head vigorously. "No. I'm a nurse. I was hired to care for the old man upstairs. Edward. I just found the door." She knelt down. "Who are you?" The man blinked, trying to process her words. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Croft." The name hit Nora like a physical blow. Edward's missing business partner. He was alive. He had been here for 5 years. Victor, Samuel spat the name with hatred. He blamed me for his mother's death. It was an accident. But he thought we had money hidden. He brought me here to make me talk. I've told him 1,000 times. There is no fortune. But he won't let me go. He can't. He's in too deep. Nora's mind raced. This wasn't just a greedy son imprisoning his father. This was kidnapping, for years. Victor was a monster. The scraping sounds, the thumping. Victor was still coming down here, still trying to get information from this broken man. We have to get you out, Nora said firmly. We have to get help. Samuel just shook his head. The door is always locked. He's the only one with the key. He'll be back. He always comes back. As if on cue, they both heard it. A sound from the top of the basement stairs. The heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt being thrown. Victor was home. And he had just locked the only exit. Panic flooded Nora's system. The click of the lock was the sound of a trap snapping shut. She was a prisoner too. Samuel's face crumbled into hopeless resignation. He's early. He doesn't usually come until dawn. Footsteps began on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. Victor knew someone was down here. The open door upstairs, the disturbed dust. Nora looked around frantically. The small room offered no hiding place. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped at the bottom. A powerful flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Nora? Victor's voice called out, calm and pleasant. Nora, are you down here? I thought we had an understanding. Nora pressed against the cold stone wall, trying to control her breathing. The flashlight beam swept past the open door, then swung back. It illuminated the doorway. Ah, there you are, Victor said, his voice now carrying a hard edge. And you've met Samuel. How lovely. He stepped into the doorway, a dark silhouette. In his hand, he held a heavy-duty zip tie. His charming mask was gone. His face was cold and merciless. This is unfortunate, Nora. I liked you. You followed instructions. Almost. He shook his head. But now you've seen something you shouldn't have. I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate. It will be easier for everyone. Nora's fear turned to anger. She thought of Edward, trapped upstairs. She thought of Samuel, 5 years stolen. She wouldn't make it easy for him. As Victor took a step into the room, his attention fixed on Nora, Samuel Croft moved. It was a desperate move born of 5 years of captivity. He lunged from the mattress, not at Victor, but at his legs. His thin arms wrapped around Victor's ankles, yanking hard. Caught off guard, Victor stumbled, his flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling away. He cursed, trying to kick Samuel off, but the man held on. Run! Samuel croaked at Nora. Go! Now! Nora didn't hesitate. She darted past the struggling men, out of the small room and into the main basement. The flashlight had stopped spinning, its beam pointing towards a far wall. She ran, her bare feet slapping on the cold concrete. Behind her, she heard Victor's enraged roar and a sickening thud as he freed himself. She could hear his footsteps pounding after her. She reached the stairs and flew up them, her lungs burning. She slammed into the green door at the top, but it was still locked from the outside. She was trapped. She could hear Victor on the bottom steps. In a desperate act, she grabbed the metal nail file still clenched in her fist. Victor burst through the doorway, his face a mask of fury, reaching for her. With all her strength, Nora swung the nail file, not at his face, but at the light switch on the wall. The glass shattered, sparks flew, and the alcove was plunged into absolute darkness. Victor, blinded, stumbled and cursed, reaching out into the blackness. Nora dropped to the floor, crawling silently away from the stairs, into the main hall. She could hear his heavy breathing, his hands slapping against the walls. She had only seconds. Silence. Victor had stopped moving, listening. Nora pressed herself behind a large oak chest, barely daring to breathe. Then, a new sound. A light flicked on from the top of the grand staircase. Mrs. Hyde stood there in her nightgown, holding an old oil lamp. Her face was pale with shock and resolve. Her eyes swept the hall and landed on Victor near the basement door. Then they found Nora. Victor saw where she was looking and turned, a snarl forming on his lips. But Mrs. Hyde spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Victor. It's over." She held up her other hand. In it was a cordless phone, its screen glowing. "I've had this for years. A satellite phone. I just used it. I called the state police. I told them everything. About Mr. Croft. About the basement. I've watched you for 5 years. But I will not be a party to murder." The distant sound of sirens pierced the mountain silence. Victor looked from Mrs. Hyde to Nora to the basement door. For a moment, he looked like he might run. But there was nowhere to go. Nora slowly got to her feet, trembling. She looked at Mrs. Hyde, who gave her a solemn nod. Then she looked towards the top of the stairs. Edward Price stood there, leaning on his cane, wrapped in his plaid blanket. He was looking down at his son, his face a mixture of sorrow and relief. He met Nora's eyes and, for the first time, smiled. A real, genuine smile. The sirens grew louder. The truth was finally coming home.